At exactly 1:58 in the morning, a hospital security camera recorded something that no one working that shift has ever been able to explain. The hallway outside room 14 had been empty for nearly 20 minutes. It was the quiet hour of the night when a hospital seems to pause between breaths. Visiting hours had ended long ago, most patients were asleep, and the few staff members still working moved quietly through the corridors trying not to wake anyone. Fluorescent lights reflected off the polished floors, creating a long sterile hallway that stretched past rows of silent patient rooms. For a while, nothing moved on the camera feed except the faint flicker of overhead lights and the occasional shadow from equipment along the wall. The hallway outside room 14 had been empty for nearly 20 minutes. The corridor remained silent and still under the dim fluorescent lighting, the kind of silence that feels heavier the longer it lasts. Then, without warning, a figure appeared at the far end of the corridor. The man walked slowly toward room 14. His pace was calm and controlled, the kind of pace you would expect from someone who belonged there. He was wearing hospital scrubs, but there was something about the way he moved that felt slightly wrong. Not dramatic, not obvious, just slightly unnatural. When he reached the door to room 14, he stopped. And then he stood there. For 1 minute and 47 seconds, the man did not move at all. Not a shift of his weight, not a glance down the hallway, nothing. He simply stood perfectly still outside the patient's door. Eventually, after standing motionless for nearly 2 minutes, the figure slowly lifted his head and looked directly at the security camera. And then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile or the casual expression of someone noticing a camera. It was slow and deliberate, almost like he knew someone would eventually watch the footage. After a few seconds, the man turned and walked down the hallway until he disappeared beyond the edge of the camera frame. No doors opened.
No stairwell alarm sounded.
And when hospital security later checked the building's access logs, there was no record of anyone entering or leaving that floor at that time. What made the footage truly disturbing, however, was not the figure itself. It was the patient inside room 14. Because earlier that night, that patient had told me he had already seen that same man standing inside his hospital room. My name is Daniel, and at the time this happened I had been working as a night shift nurse for almost 6 years. In that time, I had seen things that most people only encounter in their worst nightmares. Medical emergencies, patients coding without warning, families receiving news that completely changed their lives. Working in emergency medicine changes the way you process fear. After a while, your brain learns to separate emotions from procedures. You stop reacting emotionally and start reacting logically. Everything becomes a problem that needs a solution: symptoms, causes, treatments. Everything has an explanation if you look closely enough. At least that is what I believed before the night of March 4th. That evening started like hundreds of other shifts before it. I was assigned to the post-surgical recovery floor, where patients spend their first night after surgery while doctors monitor their condition. Most of the patients on that floor had undergone routine operations earlier in the day. Knee replacements, hip replacements, abdominal procedures. Nothing unusual. By the time the night shift started, most of them were already asleep under the lingering effects of anesthesia and pain medication. There were 22 rooms on the floor, and 3 of us covering them that night. Me, another nurse named Daria, and our charge nurse Marcus stationed at the main desk near the elevators. Everything was quiet in the predictable way night shifts usually are. Monitors humming softly, dim hallway lights, and the steady rhythm of nurses performing routine checks. Around 11 that night, the call light above room 14 turned on. When I entered the room, I immediately sensed that something was wrong. The patient, a 67-year-old man recovering from knee replacement surgery, was sitting upright in his bed, staring toward the foot of the mattress. His face was pale in a way that made me pause in the doorway. Not the pale expression of someone in pain or discomfort. It was the pale expression people have when they have just seen something that genuinely frightened them. I asked him what was wrong. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Then he said something that immediately changed the tone of the room. "There was a man standing there," he said quietly, pointing toward the foot of the bed. I looked toward the space he was pointing at. It was empty. The chair in the corner was empty. The bathroom door was open and clearly unoccupied. I checked the room anyway just to reassure him, looking behind the door and inside the small closet. Nothing. When I returned to the bedside, he was still staring at the same spot on the floor. He told me the man had been wearing hospital scrubs but was not anyone he recognized from the staff that evening. According to him, the stranger had simply stood there silently for several seconds, watching him. Then the man had smiled and walked out of the room. I stepped into the hallway immediately after hearing that, but the corridor was completely empty. From a medical perspective, the explanation seemed obvious. Post-surgery hallucinations sometimes occur in older patients after anesthesia. Medication can create images that feel completely real. So I reassured him, checked his vital signs, and told him I would continue monitoring him through the night. As I left the room, he said something that lingered in my mind longer than I expected. "He'll be back," he said quietly, not as a guess, as a certainty. About an hour later, the call light from room 14 turned on again. When I walked back into the room, the patient was pressed against the headboard as far as he could get, gripping the bed rails tightly. His eyes were fixed on the exact same spot in the room. "He came back," he whispered. According to him, the man had returned and stood in the same place as before. This time he stayed longer, watching silently. Then the man turned his head toward the window, paused for a moment, and looked back at the bed. And once again, he smiled before leaving the room. That was the moment I decided to call Marcus to perform a second assessment. Medically speaking, everything still looked normal. His vital signs were stable. Oxygen levels were good. There were no signs of neurological problems. Still, while Marcus checked the monitors, I noticed something strange. The air near the foot of the bed felt different. Not colder or warmer, just heavier somehow, like the space itself felt occupied. I didn't say anything about it. Just after 2 in the morning, Marcus decided to review the hallway security footage. Earlier, the patient had briefly tried to stand despite his surgery, and Marcus needed to confirm the timeline for the incident report. We pulled up the camera feed from the hallway outside room 14. At first, the footage showed exactly what we expected, an empty corridor under fluorescent lighting. Then Marcus suddenly paused the video. On the screen was a man wearing hospital scrubs walking down the hallway toward room 14. Neither of us recognized him. The man stopped directly outside the door and stood there. Marcus actually timed it 1 minute and 47 seconds without moving. Then the man slowly looked upward toward the security camera. Even through the grainy resolution of the footage, one detail was unmistakable.
He was smiling.
Security searched the entire building afterward. Every stairwell, every exit, every hallway. No staff member matched the description. No access logs recorded anyone entering or leaving the floor. According to the hospital's records, the man in the footage should not have been there at all. 2 days later, the patient from room 14 was discharged. Before leaving, he stopped by the nurse's station and asked if we had figured out who the man was. I told him no. He nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. Then he told me something that made the situation even harder to explain. This had been his 3rd surgery in the past 10 years. And after each of the previous 2 surgeries at completely different hospitals, he had experienced the same dream, a man wearing scrubs standing silently at the foot of his bed, watching him, smiling. Until that moment, he had always believed it was just a dream caused by medication. I never told him about the security footage. Some questions are better left unanswered. I finished that shift, but I never worked another overnight shift after that night. And whenever I think about the footage, the detail that disturbs me the most isn't the man standing outside the door. It's the moment he looked directly at the camera. Because the expression on his face didn't look like someone who was being recorded. It looked like someone who knew he was.